Okay, well, as anyone who was around the Pacific Northwest knows, we had quite a few weeks this summer of very, very smoky weather all through Bellingham as a result of wildfires, both here in Washington, fires up in British Columbia, and fires in California as well. And late during the summer months, I was having a conversation with our dean, Steve Hollenhorst, and he said, gee, you know, if only we could get somebody who could come talk about wildfires in the seminar series, maybe, you know, somebody who had spent their youth fighting wildfires, and somebody who's done research on wildfires, and maybe even somebody who's testified in front of a Senate committee here in the Pacific Northwest on wildfires. And we thought about it for a while, and then we realized, oh wait, that's Michael Medler. He lives here. So we've got Michael Medler today, who will be talking about all of those things. So.
Well, thanks, Dave. That's a great warm-up here. Please excuse my flashing eyes and the lights here, trying to get used to this new Huxley Speaker Series recording process. It's great to be here, and I have a few things I want to talk about today. And part of it is a little straying from the normal scientist routine, and part of that's because I have been spending a lot of time making recommendations and testifying before committees and things like that. So I actually am going to venture into the rare terrain of making policy recommendations and stuff like that as we get going. But first off, let me back up. As Dave said, I've been involved with fire a long time. This is actually my copy of Smokey the Bear my mommy gave me a while ago after she dug it back up and realized we still had it. So, oh. And way back when clouds of pterodactyls still darkened the skies in the 80s, I worked as a firefighter back when I had hips and knees and whatnot. And we screwed around a lot and we fought a lot of fires. This is Yellowstone, 1988. Wasn't all adventure, but it was a really formative time for me. We spent a lot of time working around 200-foot flames, and we spent a lot of time working deep in the backcountry, and I learned to use a chainsaw by cutting down trees in wilderness areas all day long for day after day. And it meant a lot to me, and it really launched me on a career in wildland fire that cycled around a bunch of different elements. And even back then, in the 80s, I first did my first academic writing a paper with my father on the effects of the Yellowstone fire on wildland fire policy at the time. So fast forward, now here it is almost 30 years later, and a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same problems are coming up. And as Dave said, we just had a heck of a fire season here in Washington and a heck of a fire season nationally, and it's not over yet. We're still churning along. May well hit 10 million acres this year. Come on, we can do it, and we're getting close. Now, as Dave said, I had the honor of testifying before a Senate committee just a couple weeks ago. I've also testified for congressional committees about fire. You really have to look to committee meetings about Planned Parenthood to find as white and male of a crowd here. But what we were called here to do was to offer advice to Cantwell and Barrasso in the Senate about bills that are under consideration now to change the way we handle wildfire in this country. And so a group of illustrious, mostly bearded, balding old men sat around and told a set of senators what we thought some of the solutions were to the problems we were seeing. And we did not agree a lot, but what I'm going to do now is kind of run through some of my thinking, a little tiny sliver of some research I've done over the last decade, and what kind of recommendations came out of that thinking for a group like this, who were trying to write down what they thought the experts were saying to try to incorporate it into bills that will now be very politically massaged and compromised into forms that may actually have a hope of passing. I actually think the current sets of wildfire bills working through the House and the Senate may be the one thing that really comes out of a fairly, I don't have to explain to you just how fractious Congress we're dealing with now, but it's something people seem to be circling around. Now, back up. We are all particularly dour in this photo because this was our moment of silence for what had just happened literally a few days before. Now, we've had a lot of bad fire seasons over the last decade, particularly in the West. We've been breaking records in Washington, and we have this one other cost that is a little hard on me. I have trouble now recommending firefighting in the same way I used to. I have a daughter who's 20 years old, is on the crew team, almost 6 feet tall, can lift up 200-pound things like sleeping in the dirt. She'd make a great firefighter. And when she was a kid, the whole time, I always said, hey, I know how you're going to pay your way through college. You're going to get on fire crews. And I'm less enthusiastic about that. And the reasons are that when I was a firefighter, we were trained to run away. I can think of only a few things we said more often than run away, while we were in Yellowstone in 1988. We said run away all the time. It's what we were trained to do. We were given specific permission by the Forest Service to always run away. They would never second guess our judgment. And we ran away from everything because we were deep in wilderness and things were burning and wow, that's cool, but I'm out of here. The West has really been changing. We've been building and building and building into places that we now throw our firefighters into and expect to protect. Now, frankly, we have not changed the way we train our firefighters. We have not changed the protocols very much. I have firefighters in my class right now. We were just talking about how many hours of training they receive before they're put in structural protection mode. And you know, they're sitting there joking like, did you hear about the, like, don't stand by the propane tank? They're like, yeah, that's what they told me too. There's a lot to working around buildings and communities that is not what our backcountry firefighters are trained for. And this is just one example of a system in which we're using old 20th and maybe mid-20th century policies and approaches to a problem that now has a whole lot of 21st century issues and complexity. For example, if you look down on the lower corner, there's that gigantic summer of 1988. Way down here. That's that first blip, $1 billion summer. Hundreds and hundreds of fires with thousands of people on them, costing $1 billion, and almost 4 million acres burned that summer. And that was a big, big deal because for decades that hadn't happened. And then just 2 years later, 90, nearly as big. Now that looks kind of quaint. You look up to the last 10 years, those monstrous big years of the 80s are now small years. Those are our nice, calm, well, didn't really hear much about fires this year because there wasn't many more than we had in the great big fire years of Yellowstone in '88. So we've really changed. And the costs, it's actually a lot more complicated than this graph. This is basic federal firefighting costs have been going up and up and up, more or less in conjunction with these fires. Now, there's a set of drivers that are pretty widely agreed to be driving a couple of these. I'm going to leave out the fairly complicated financial and the financial incentives and the way the federal government disperses money for right now. But the fires that we've been seeing are burning more acres and being more expensive in this country, largely because of climate change, the last century of fire policies that have continued for almost 100 years now, and rapid development into the wildland-urban interface. We're building really quickly out into these areas. So all of that combines to make for bigger fires and more expensive fires and more catastrophic problems when we fight fires, whether it's air tanker crashes, firefighter fatalities, etc. So, the climate part, not very contentious, interestingly enough. We've had some real changes in the climate in which Western fires in particular have been happening. We have a much longer fire season now, interestingly. From the 70s till now, we've had some real changes in just how many months the Forest Service is in active mode here in the western United States. Now that leaves out things that also are going on in different levels, like the lengths of the the Santa Ana wind season in Southern California and what goes on in Florida. But here in the West, we've got about 2 months more of fire season each year, which is pretty staggering, and that accounts for a lot of the changes in the sizes. Changes in temperature. Small changes in temperature can have big effects on how big a fires and when they burn. Particularly, I have right now one grad student looking into the linkage between how long the snow stays on the ground and how many fires and how big the fires get in the following seasons. And that's a particular interest now when we have California experimenting with a new no-snow winter from last year. And, you know, we're having some real interesting changes in snowpack dynamics as well. Now, I had this video that I was hoping to show because it explains a lot of things better than I could. Please bear with me if some incredibly embarrassing ad pops up or something, but...
Survivors of the 1871 fire in Peshtigo, Wisconsin, which vaporized 1.5 million acres of forest and killed 1,500 people, reported a wall of flame 5 miles wide that traveled at 90 miles per hour and tossed trains into the air. 4 decades later, an even larger inferno roared through the Rocky Mountains, scorching an area the size of Connecticut. These epic wildfires and similar ones in between helped spawn the U.S. Forest Service and forged its aggressive policy to not only prevent wildfires, but to smother any that did start by no later than 10 a.m. the next day. And for a time, this policy seemed to work. The annual number of fires and area burned plummeted between 1920 and 1970. But fewer fires led to denser, more flammable forests, packed with the combustible needles of young conifers and the tinder-dry branches of dead or dying trees. So despite a continuing decline in the number of wildfires since 1970, the average blaze today burns hotter, faster, and bigger than it used to. And the total area burned per year in the US has more than doubled. Costs have flared too. The Forest Service now spends 52% of its annual budget on fire prevention and suppression, up from 16% just 20 years ago. What's more, wildfires will keep getting harder to tame as climate change turns forests hotter and drier, and homes edge further into fire-prone regions. The good news is that we can prevent future wildfires from getting so wild by taming forests' fuel supply now. Essentially, this means letting some fires burn, or even starting them ourselves when conditions aren't too dry or windy, or selectively logging to thin out dangerously crowded growth. When and where we've used it, this strategy has made fires cooler, slower, and less destructive. For instance, when a blaze ripped through Okanagan County in Washington state in 2006, untamed swaths of forest lost 92% of their trees, while just 49% perished in areas recently thinned by cutting and controlled burns. And in 2002, parcels of recently burned land put the brakes on wildfires racing across Arizona's pine forests. These and other successes have led forest managers to prescribe controlled burning for much of the fire-prone western US, but few forests actually receive their recommended dosage. That's largely because while the US Forest Service can in theory write prescriptions for every tract of land it manages, it relies on Congress for the money to fill them. And so far, Congress allocates the vast majority of fire management funds to emergency measures rather than preventive ones. Plus, while emergency costs continue to surge, the Forest Service's budget doesn't. So fire managers are often forced to steal money from already meager fuel reduction programs to fight this year's blazes, thus fueling the risk that next year's fires will be costlier, deadlier, and more disastrous. So as counterintuitive as controlled burns may seem, it's time for Congress to understand that by not playing with fire, they are playing with fire.
So, I actually like that nice little blaze through there, though, of a bunch of information that I don't have to tell you now because you saw the cute cartoon that infringes on Randall O'Toole's trademarks. But they packed a lot of stuff in there, and they made an interesting bunch of assumptions, and as a geographer in particular, and as a pyrogeographer, I want to unpack a little of what they were saying. Even though I find myself agreeing with most of it, at that speed and that level of simplification, some interesting assumptions get built in. Now, this is the actual comment thread. If you had clicked below that video on YouTube, this was the part I could show in a classroom because of the words usually used on comment threads about these. I had to look at this one for a while to make sure we weren't too far into F-bombs and Nazis, which is usually where these comment threads go pretty quick. So, given that there's this problem, historical oracle says, why burn it and throw heaps of CO2 into the air? Why not log it, which is profitable and doesn't throw CO2 in there? Very reasonable question. And a question that we're dealing with congressionally. This is why Maria Cantwell and Senator Barrasso are having these hearings, is there's a fairly fiery debate going on right now. In fact, this is today's Herald, just from hours ago. Once again, officials discussing ways to reduce the size of fires. So Cantwell is meeting with folks in Spokane, getting recommendations of how to use drones and more firefighting and more thinning, and the drumbeat is, we need to do something. We've got these big fires, we need to thin, we need to get the loggers going, we need to get roads in, and do something to stop these fires before they happen. Now this harkens back over 12 years, 13 years, to something us old folks might remember, which was the Healthy Forest Initiative, still in many ways the law of the land here. And this was a Bush administration, even going back into Clinton administration program, that tried to do a bunch of things to address the exact same issues. Coming out of '88 and going into the '90s, we saw that fires were getting bigger, and the Healthy Forest Initiative, essentially, amongst other activities, spent a lot of federal money to thin fuels on federal lands in the wildland-urban interface area near our communities that had big fuel buildups. Now, I've written papers and talked about that for a while. The only catch was almost no lands fit that set of descriptions. And so a lot of money got spent thinning outside of those urban land, wildland interfaces, spent doing thinning in other places. So this has been a controversy for a long time. And there's elements of it like, well, what is the wildland-urban interface? Different groups, different states have actually been lobbying to have different lands included to get access to the billions of dollars the Healthy Forest Initiative made available. Now here, just this year, here's some fire maps that Mitch Friedman got me a little bit ago. We had a bunch of fires in Washington, million-ish acres over the summer, and these occurred mostly on the east side, though we had a little bit of west side adventure. But these fires are a pretty classic example of what we're up against in a modern 21st century Western US ecosystem fire relationship, because they're not happening where those monies were intended to be spent. In fact, if you look at these fires, which I'm sorry the map's a little hard to read, I didn't have time to make a better one, but these red fire perimeters, you can see that a lot of these perimeters aren't even in what we would call forest. What's more interesting is some of these really big fires, the Okanagan fires, the large fires that you heard about in the press. 95% of the land being burned is not federal land. So it's not the Forest Service's job to thin and protect. It's not the Forest Service's job to do all that work in the off-season. So we've got some interesting financial issues going on as the federal government tries to figure out what they can do on other people's lands, state, tribe, private, farmlands. These are the kinds of things that we're now seeing in big 100,000, million acre kind of allotments, fires burning just this year here in Washington. So the other element that the Healthy Forest Initiative targeted were forests that what we used to call condition class 3. And what that meant was places where there haven't been fires where there used to be fires. In essence, forest fires burn through and clear out understory and branches, like the little video, so I don't have to belabor this. And if you don't do that, and you let time click along, after a while you get fuel buildup, you get dead branches, and more importantly, you get live understory that's very flammable. Those little green needles of fresh trees, that's what fires burn best, very explosive. And you get fire up into the canopies. And a forest that used to burn every 10 years, that's had a 100-year break, will now burn really differently. When a fire comes through a forest that's had a 100-year break, you're going to kill trees that wouldn't have been killed if you'd had a fire every 10 years. You change the ecosystem. You change the whole host of species. You change what kind of animals can live there. You change the sizes of the patches where trees are killed. You change reseeding. All kinds of things happen when you change the fire regime of an area by doing things like suppressing fire for 50 to 100 years. Aquila Flower showed this slide in class the other day, so I grabbed it from her. Here's some evidence of this exact same thing going on. What you see here are fire scars on a tree, and you see these fires happening 1814, 20, 23, 28, 34. Nice, even rate of fires, and then the last fire, 1898, and then boom, nothing for almost 100 years. There's fire suppression. Maybe effects like grazing. That's changing stuff. The forest doesn't just sit there and go, oh, no more fire, I'll just be exactly the same for 100 years, right? It's going to go through a lot of changes, and that will change how fires burn there, change how ecosystems behave. Starts to look like this. As a firefighter, this was kind of what all of Yellowstone looked like before we got there. There had been huge buildups. But it's more complicated. As a pyrogeographer, a nice simple answer for Flagstaff, Arizona may not make any sense in Wyoming and may make no sense in the Olympic Peninsula. What was going on in Yellowstone had been going on for hundreds of years. The fuels have been building up for 350 years. A couple decades of fire suppression wasn't why those forests burned so hot. So it's complicated. However, we have a pretty good handle now on the areas where this sort of stuff's going on. And the Forest Service put out an estimate a while ago. A number, 400 million acres. This is the kind of stuff we throw around in my business all the time. We use acres because, well, we don't use hectares. That'd be confusing. So we use this old antiquated English system in most of fire science, and if I tell somebody 400 million acres or 4 million acres or 40 million acres, odds are you don't change your head about what we're talking about. So, as a geographer, I'll throw this up. 400 million acres is in need of treatment. That's the Forest Service's estimate in the US. That's places that fire has been suppressed so long that if it burns now, the ecosystem will change. Something will happen. It won't be what was going on before. That's our condition class 3, the old label. And the Healthy Forest Initiative actually said you couldn't spend money mitigating fuel problems unless it was condition class 3 land. So there was kind of a gold rush. If you had a city and you wanted some money, you made sure that your neighboring forests were all declared condition class 3. So I think there's a little bit of exaggeration in this. But 400 million acres is give or take the size of Alaska. And that's one of those things I want you to put in your mind as if you have some idea of how big Alaska is, right? The only reason I'm using that is because you've been told for a long time it's really big. But it is. It's really big, right? Anyone here ever drive across Alaska? Yeah, it's not something you do lightly. It's a big damn place. It goes on forever. So, along those lines, about an area about half that size, 200 million acres, is in the wildland-urban interface, this part where this all blends together, where we also were supposed to be spending money to work on it. So that's an area about the size of Texas, give or take. So going back to Texas and Alaska's feud over who's big is big, just to put some numbers on it. Now, what does thinning look like? Well, there's mechanical thinning. Here's getting out machines, chainsaws, and thinning. Having spent weeks of my life thinning acres, I can tell you, 8 well-trained Forest Service employees with chainsaws, it takes days or weeks to thin a couple acres and then make piles and then burn them. This is not a quick thing. So the idea of 400 million acres, that is a literally sort of you and what army, and I mean what army. That's a, okay, hire 1 million people kind of round number kind of thing. Like, well, let's get 1 million people, let's hire them, and have them work all year. You know, it's that kind of, if we're going to go out with chainsaws and do it the old-fashioned way, it's a unimaginably big project. We've been going around and doing this. It works easier in forests like this. You know, the thinning tends to work in these nice industrial areas. You throw in some terrain and some cliffs and some lack of roads, and mechanical thinning starts to look really, really impossible. And a whole lot of these 400 million acres look more like this. Now, the short answer is we're not going to use chainsaws and machines to thin 400 million acres. However, you light a match, you can get a lot of work done. And so by putting fire back where it has been, you can actually get millions of acres treated. Huge questions. I'm not saying that doesn't come with a lot of complicated questions and very interesting policy agenda issues when you start talking about lighting matches in the forest, but we have been doing it. Each year we're doing about 2 million acres a year of treatment, of which about 1.5 million acres is done with fire, prescribed fire. The language changes. Every 10 years we come up with a new word, but I'm going to stick to the old language of prescribed fire and wildland fire use, where if you have a fire already burning, we have in some situations backed off, particularly in the Southwest, New Mexico, Arizona, and said, all right, well, let's let it burn and see if it can do some of this work that we otherwise were going to have to get in here in chainsaws. And it's a very effective way to get big numbers, millions of acres per year treated. So to go back to that, of the 400 million acres that need treatment, the Forest Service and its allies are treating about 2 million acres a year. Now, we're falling behind a lot faster than 2 million, so it's still a losing battle, but we are getting started. Right now, when we do treat, we treat the low-hanging fruit. Ponderosa pine forests on flattish grounds where we can do some combinations of thinning and fire. That tends to be where we're getting this work done. Now, about a little more than a decade ago, I started doing some research here, asking some questions about this, and this was the data I had at that point. This is all of the fires for a decade in the United States in the lower 48, each dot representing either a human-caused or lightning fire. One of my favorite data sets to talk about data sets with, because, wow, there's some wacky stuff in this data. Check out some of the states in the south here. Some lots of fires, some, hey, we don't do the fire thing. That's them over on the other side of the border. I'm suspecting that's not an accurate representation. You'll also note that a great deal of the country organizes their fires a lot better than we do. That's Thomas Jefferson's township and range system. That's county courthouses at every township and range section line, where we now have little water towers in the center of each little town as you drive through in Nebraska. You know where that water tower is? There's also the county seat, and that's where they reported the fires from, so that's where we had information they were from. You'll note that in the West, we actually at least try to keep some idea. Now, I had this data set, which was actually pretty good for the actual numbers and acreages, and this data set came out. Some friends of mine were working on national level data, and this is still pretty rough, but what we have here is natural fire regimes. And this goes back to this idea of how often fires have occurred historically for hundreds or thousands of years. And this is a super rough map, but it has these ranges, these areas where fires occurred between every 35 and 100 years versus up here where fires happen more often than every 200 years. And this let some GIS students of mine do some basic number crunching, and we did a little project. And the question was, well, okay, that's great, but then on average, if all of these systems that we've spent millions of dollars through NASA and other groups to define are having fires at their natural rate, how much fire would we be having each year? Because if we're not having that number, those systems are changing. That's your forest becoming condition class 2. That's your fuels building up. And we came up with this wacky number. And I remember the first time we did this, like, okay, back to the drawing boards. That's too big. What did we do wrong? 26 million acres annually. Now, that's not to say each of these areas has to burn 26 million acres a year, but in order for this national level ecosystem not to be changing, that's what needs to happen. However, our fire records indicated we're burning about 3 million acres a year. So here's the rundown. This is 10-year-old data, 10-year-old project, a bunch of students. We're falling behind about 23 million acres a year in the US. This number got a lot of press. I got to go talk to a lot of different people about it. And when I started digging around historically, it's one of those things, you look at the fire records back into the 60s, and no, you don't get 26 million acres a year. You get 3 million, 4 million, 3 million. A big year in the 60s, 7 million. It just wasn't there. But when you look deeper into the historical record, check out the 20s. 26 million a year. Exact same number. That's the point at which a bunch of undergrads in a GIS lab do all these little high fives and stuff, because Medler's wrong, that number is reasonable. In fact, in the 30s, you had even bigger numbers. Now, this is colored by a lot of things going on. There's a lot of logging, we've got slash, we've got Michigan burns, and then Wisconsin burns. I mean, kind of, then Bandon and Oregon burn in huge fires. A very different time. Since we introduced military-style firefighting, helicopters, bulldozers, crews of 20, people jumping out of airplanes with parachutes, boom, down to 9 million, then 4. And that's about where it stayed until this data set ended. So part of my little project was, well, the East and West are really different. We had data for the West. So I did also run it just for the Western US, because let's face it, it's different. We do our fires differently here. Ignoring the pine barrens and parts of Florida, we just have a different sort of system with big fires out in the American West. And sure enough, it was still about half of what we're talking about. Falling behind 10, 12 million acres a year. Big number. Now, the exciting part is Jake Lesser, a grad student I'm working with here, and I have been working on a project where we finally have the data we wished we had back then. So this is one of those make sure we were right. Land fire project, tens of millions of dollars spent by the federal government using satellites to get better data, have gone through and come up with much better data on mean fire return intervals for the entire United States. How often did these systems used to burn? And we have way better fire data now. We have really great data on the locations of all the fires in the western United States going back for a much longer time period. And we were able to this time take the extra time and the GIS data layers to cut out things like all that green agriculture land, just chop that out. All the gray developed land, just chop that out. We're not going to use that in our analysis. We're just going to talk about the stuff where fires are still happening. Fascinating to see how well agriculture stops forest fires. So this is going to be the check on our previous go through a decade ago now that we have good data. And for good measure, we included Alaska, which is once again huge and counts for a lot of land, and so really should have upped our numbers. And we did the whole thing again. It's about the same numbers. 10 years later, entirely different data, this time good data. Having been told before your numbers are crazy, it's because the data's bad. Now we have really good data that we're trusting a lot more, and we're still talking 12, 13 million in the western United States. The extra pulse is really Alaska's added to that acreage. Even though we're burning more, 4 or 5 million acres a year, we're still falling behind in this huge number. And there's a bunch of other papers coming out. Just this week, I've been seeing links to new papers. There's one that came out a couple months ago in the Proceedings of the National Academy, working through other methods to come up with the fire deficit numbers. How far behind are we falling in the western United States? And the short answer is a lot. That as much as this year seems like a big fire season with 10 million acres, we're losing ground every year on these ecosystems, and in big, big numbers. Well, so what? What are you going to do about it? What's the deal? What are you going to do about it congressionally? What are you going to do with the Forest Service? So here's one of my take-home messages. We will not fix this with chainsaws. We will not fix this by building roads and cutting and thinning massive, massive tracts of land. And this is what I stood up and tried to make very clear to Cantwell and Barrasso the other day is, I'm a geographer. You just can't do it. It's too damn big. You and what army? 1 million people in chainsaws? You're going to hire 1 million people, Mr. Barrasso? I don't think so. So here's what we're up against. If you really want to start thinning at that scale, you're not going to do it with chainsaws and trucks and machines. You're going to have to reintroduce fire. We also can't keep putting out all the damn fires that are doing the work we're talking about needing done. Right now we have a warfare model against most all of our big wildfires. The folks that work in these districts, where a lot of these fires are occurring on federal lands in particular, have fire prescriptions. They would love to be getting millions of acres, and yet when the fires do start, we spend $1 billion or $2 billion a year to make sure to stomp them out and put them out as best we can. This is an old model. It's very expensive, has lots of unfortunate consequences. Here's the Twisp River after a tanker dropped nearby. Having seen creeks in my career that had way less retardant than this, the next thing you see is hundreds and hundreds of dead fish. So these sorts of systems that we're using now have really expensive costs, serious ecological consequences, hard on the ecosystems, hard on the people, and we have to start introducing millions of acres of fire every year. And that's kind of a crazy thing to say. There's Medler saying, we need to burn the woods. Sounds like I'm from some of our southern states where they actually kind of get that message. It's like, let's just burn it all again. Which they do, because it's great for hunting, it's great for fish, it's great for ducks. Up here in this part of the country, that's crazy talk, right? But we have to start changing a 1950s and 60s approach to wildland fire, and one of the things we need to do is start getting serious acres on the ground. However, we have built so much stuff out there. So much stuff. We have put houses and towns and communities and roads into places that burned like crazy just a few decades ago. And Medler up here saying, well, let's burn the woods down is all fine and dandy, but that means I'm burning down everybody's houses, and it's not acceptable, and I'm an absolute jerk for saying we should burn down the woods around where everybody lives. And we've digitally inserted roads and communities and houses into the middle of all those areas where we still need a million plus acres going off in each little region every year to sustain these ecosystems, or we're going to have to start cutting, or the fires are going to get bigger, or we're going to see more effects on watersheds and all those sorts of things. Interesting questions arise about planning and zoning and whose houses are they. I've got GIS students looking at interesting questions, hopefully soon, like how many of those are second and third homes? Do people really live there? Is that weekend stuff? But we'll talk a lot about those sort of things in class. Now, back through the numbers. 400 million acres. Big as Alaska is in need of treatment. 200 million of that is in this WUI area. We're only treating about 2 million acres a year currently. And Medler says we need to burn 20 a year. So we need to be burning 10, 20, 30, I don't know, you pick, some tens of millions of acres. We can talk about how many tens of millions, but we're talking tens of millions of acres a year. Now here's the interesting part. Forest fires very, very seldom burn up houses. House fires burn up houses. Forest fires get to places where there's houses, and they light a house on fire, and then the thing that happens is usually an urban conflagration, moves house to house to house. This is actually eucalyptus, one of the most explosive trees known to mankind. And these houses did not catch fire because of a forest fire. Once one house is going and you lose the water supply in your urban fire system, and you've got decks with wood on them, and you've got people with branches up against those decks, these fires move from house to house to house. So when forest fires are burning up our communities, yes, often a fire can arrive as a big scary thing, but what tends to happen is something like this. This is a fairly standard urban fire disaster where a fire comes down. The red houses are the ones that burned up. The other ones didn't. It's kind of like those things where the tornado just picks one house and leaves another. And folks have done a lot of work on why this goes on and what happens, and it has to do with very simple little mitigation efforts that people can do at the community or house level. In fact, on this particular fire, one of the main drivers was rain gutters. Houses now have lots of angles on them. In the bad old days, houses had 2 flat planes and rain gutters. Now they have, it's like a sign of wealth. My house has 31 different planes on the roof. And like 100 years ago, it was how many chimneys you had. And now it's like, my house is more complicated than your house. And where those rain gutters line up under stuff, you've got a rain gutter, it's summer, you let pine needles and branches get down, just a little layer of biological goop in there, and it dries out. One little ash rolls up on your now fireproof roof, it rolls down the rain gutter, and boof, you've got a little fire running in your rain gutter. And then thanks to the angles, the fire has a place to go to get under a little wooden soffit and burn your house down. And nearly all of these houses were ignited by that phenomenon. So Some places are now looking at things like, hey, no rain gutters. You live in Colorado, you need the snow off the roof anyway. Figure out the drainage down below, no rain gutters, your house will be way more fireproof. Get the wooden decks off the grass, don't keep the propane and firewood up on the wooden deck. You know, there's stuff like that you can do. We're seeing now lots of science. This is once again pictures where the fires that burned through and burned all these houses burned through an area of dense, wet, green vegetation. These fires are going house to house. Now, I'm not saying that's the only thing that happens, but it's pretty common. So we have now national level efforts to try to help people understand how to protect their houses. And we have these zones, you know, yeah, get the firewood off the deck close, and then around there you need room to work. What firefighters need to see is room to move their engines, room to get around. And that's the critical element for protecting houses and communities. Now I'm going to tell a quick story here about two communities. A couple years ago, same afternoon, I was watching two different news feeds all afternoon. I was calling friends, same thing. Fire burns into Colorado Springs, Waldo Canyon fire. Did $1 billion of damage, which is easy when you got $1 million houses. You only have to burn 1,000 of them by my rough calculations. And this fire burned down into this community, came down off the front slopes there in Colorado Springs, came down into town, and took out a subdivision that had been built up onto this hillside with very nice, very expensive houses. Simultaneously, a fire was burning in Boulder, Colorado. Almost identical terrain, kind of prettier front hill sandstone slabs, but other than that, remarkably similar topography, geography, wind, and urban development down at the bottom where the city was. The net results were radically different. And what was different in Boulder? Well, I'm not going to say, you know, the fires were identical test tubes. I can't arrange the test tube experiment I need here, but they were really close. These fires were happening in the same weather, same wind pattern, same geography, and the fire burned down to Boulder, Colorado, came down the same slopes with downslope winds at the same speeds, and it hit that big green part. And everything was fine. No big deal. And now, this big green part, they have roads in there where they could run fire engines. They were able to put out a few crews. They were able to put little hoses out and do a little spot work. And they had hundreds, not thousands of firefighters fanned out and stopped this fire from coming into Boulder the way it had done in Colorado Springs. Now, here, take a look at that in that green spot. Here, this is now Colorado Springs, roughly the same view. Over the last 40 years, Colorado Springs instead had developed that into a nice neighborhood with $1 million homes. At this interface between the forests that we knew were going to burn, they burn all the time, they burn hot, they burn windy, and Boulder had this entirely different result. Now, Boulder didn't set out to do that on purpose, but we have these buffers now starting to form in other cities, once again, for other reasons. Missoula, Montana has the same sort of thing. Now, the Missoulas and the Boulders actually actively maintain fire regimes in these park areas. These are big city parks. They spend tax money, they take 0.7% of the sales tax in the city of Boulder to maintain their open sparks and mountain system. And with that, they do things like small control burns. They work with the neighborhoods and show them old pictures of how it used to look there, saying, hey, we're just trying to maintain the historical look of your neighborhood. This is how it used to look. We're trying to maintain the agricultural tradition in your neighborhood. And they even used to do what I thought was a fantastic thing. Boulder had a Christmas tree, free Christmas tree giveaway. They would lay out areas where they needed to get rid of all the trees and they're going to use mechanical thinning, and they would get tens of thousands of people would show up and all go out and help them thin trees for free. Once again, you and what army? Well, a whole bunch of Christmas tree people was your army. The program was so wildly successful that they had to cancel it. Classic city bureaucracy, because it was on weekends and there was a lot of overtime to handle the 50,000 cars that would come and park for this. Do you remember this?
They do that with snowplows too.
Yeah.
If it snows in December, you're screwed.
Exactly. Yeah, you wouldn't want to promote a successful project. Now, what Boulder had done by accident is what municipalities all over are figuring out to do about floods. I was in New Jersey for Hurricane Floyd, and it ripped through my neighborhood, and one of the real problems was that the Raritan River came up by 40 feet. Now, fascinating stuff. The problem was, down in that river floodplain, they had the hospital, the fire station, the police station, and 200 years of toxic sludge stored in 50-gallon barrels. It was a bad scene. Now, all over, we're starting to realize, wow, if you're going to have floods, that'd be a way better place for swing sets. You know, then after the flood, you go clean off the swing set, good to go. Now, your firefighters need those Boulder-type buffers. Your cities, communities, even small areas can be served by just a few hundred yards. And you don't have to make clear cuts. Boulder's maintaining a nice meadow, but you just need open space with not so many trees, enough room to run some hoses, enough for crews to move around, and it can be really pleasant stuff. And so that's community protection. Now, the census has a data set of every place that has a name, and that's not just cities and towns. I mean, this is little Nugent's Cornery kind of place, and there's 4,500 of them just in the western United States. So here's one of the little things I've been doing on and off for years and doing again. If you put a buffer around every single one of those places in the western United States, quarter-mile wide, 500 meters, and do it everywhere, beaches everywhere, here's, do it everywhere in Boulder, you get an interesting number. Now remember, we have 400 million acres, we got 200 million acres in the WUI. That buffer of everywhere is 9 million acres. Now, that's an area the size of one of those states I can't point to on this map. That's your Delawares or Rhode Islands. I mean, that's a tractable amount of land. That's not that many years of 2 million acres a year. Critically, that's a wild overestimate. Of those 9 million acres, only a small bit is where we really need to focus on. So to protect the communities, we don't need 400 million acres of thinning. We need a couple million acres of community management zones to make these communities resilient in the face of fire. So what we need are more places like Boulder that can handle a fire coming towards these communities and these towns. This is looking down, this is literally where the fire ran down towards town, and it hit that big green spot. Now, these community zones are where we already have roads, we already have communities, we have people living there. So it's where the mechanical thinning makes sense. That's where it really does make sense to hire 19-year-olds with chainsaws. These are places where we have real problems with jobs. These are the communities where you turn 20 and you get the hell out because there are no jobs. And this is the exact area we could be putting people to work trying to do this kind of mechanical thinning and stacking, and the kind of place where we already have the infrastructure to do the exciting stuff we're working on, like turning these biomass fuels that need to be thinned into things like aviation fuel or pelletizing. Now, one of the big problems is we don't have established markets. There's nowhere to sell it, there's nowhere to do this. One of the things I've been proposing is this is the kind of spot for the federal government to step in. This is where the right grants, the right subsidies can help create a situation where you get this positive feedback. If a company knew that they had access to fuels for a 10-year period and access to the market for 10 years, then it might pencil out to use these fuels. Now, there's a lot of complications and all of these sorts of things, but my point is that's where the people are, it's where the roads are, it's where the fuels are, it's the stuff we need to cut. That's where it makes sense to get in there and do that. At the same time, we need to stop the 20th century approach to fire warfare. We've got 40, 50,000 people. We've got some really exciting stuff going on with airplanes and helicopters. I mean, just like, oh, it's so exciting, I love them. But it's not a reasonable model. What we can be doing instead, as I said, is putting young people to work year-round, make career opportunities in this fuels management arena. Now, this is what we do instead. We wait till about a day before a fire, we send a fire crew out and say, oh, quick, dig a line around these houses. Instead, we could be having a year-round project for many of the communities that know they're at risk, that are using FireWise status to try to get grants, to try to get people hired, to do the kind of work we need. I believe the city of Ellensburg got a small grant and hired a bunch of goats. And they put goats out in their parks, and it worked really well. Super neat project. A couple dozen goats over a couple months, boom. They had their park down to a nice fire-resistant level. This is the kind of work that we can be doing. Simultaneously, we've got all these folks that are doing backcountry firefighting. What we need to do is start training and educating and employing year-round people whose job title is fire manager or fire monitor. I talk with my students here about this being the growth industry. You want a neat job in fire? Yeah, swinging a Pulaski or jumping out of an airplane is cool. You know what's really cool though? Walking around and checking out a fire for a couple days. That's really cool. And doing the weather observations and measuring how fast it's moving and calling down and saying it's still looking good. Maybe taking your Pulaski and kind of say, we wanted to keep it out of this one drainage because there's this endangered fish. Can you just kind of keep it out of that creek? We're starting to do that, just barely starting. We have these new career opportunities for people if we can allow fire in the backcountry. If we can start getting those tens of millions of acres in the backcountry, we will need people to work there. Not 4,000 of them on each fire like we're doing now. Not multiple tankers dropping retardant that cost $6,000 an hour. We have been experimenting with this in New Mexico a while back. They had 2 identical fires burning. They threw 2,000 people and about $100 million at one. They put 7 people and a couple $1,000s on the other, and the fires grew into roughly the same shape and had roughly the same outcomes. And this is because the secret we can't tell you during fire season, which is we can't stop them. Ain't nothing we can do on the big wildfires. We run around and throw airplanes up in the air and go, oh, we're doing stuff. Look at us do stuff. And then when the fire goes out, we dig in front of it and go, woo, saved it. Big fires are unstoppable. I'm going to say that out loud. The big, hot, windy fires are moving. You don't get in front. That's my training. That's the runaway. You never get in front. You let the fire die down. You might use a tanker to try to slow it down as it's pinching off. Get a little, the tankers can't put fires out. They slow them down enough for a fire crew to maybe get into 3-foot flame lengths and put a fire line where they can't work in 12-foot flames. That's the kind of stuff we're doing. We're not stopping the big ones as well as we want. What we're not having are the 5 or 6 other big ones that would have gone if we'd had a lot of smaller fires on the landscape earlier in the season. Now, while I'm doing doom and gloom, those numbers, those bigger numbers, we're having 10 million acres. We've lost firefighters here. We've lost hundreds of houses. I will say out loud, we haven't had a bad fire season yet. I feel like a Zeppelin pilot, like, you know, we haven't blown one up yet. I'll bet when we blow one up, they'll quit letting us fly these things. We're going to have worse fire seasons unless we do a lot about it. Climate change is not suddenly going to help us here. We're not going to suddenly stop building into the backcountry, right? These things that are driving these bigger and bigger fires are only getting worse. The ones that keep me awake are 20,000 houses in San Diego, 30,000 houses in the flanks of Los Angeles, a fire coming into Flagstaff that burns through the entire city. We haven't had that yet. I honestly think that unless we start doing something about it, I don't mean to sort of be over sensational, but we really haven't seen it yet. I really don't think we've seen what a bad fire season for humans, for structures, looks like yet. If we're going to stop that, then we need to do a bunch of stuff about it. Once again, we need to start getting more fire on the ground in a natural system. We need to start living with that fire, collaborating with it, working with it, instead of treating every fire as a warfare institutional problem in which we need to fight as aggressively as possible. And I'll cut it off there and ask for questions.